I had grown up when I was a young officer reading David's novels, and I took great comfort in the fact that when we actually went into the real world, it couldn't be that hard. And he understated it. I think the question of whether Pakistan is maybe the most dangerous place for the world, the answer is yes, in my view, at least right now. But it's not all Pakistan's fault. It's not a series of bad decisions. Part of it is geography and part of it's history. If you look at its location, particularly go back to the days of the Great Game, and then you looked at its post-1947 as a independent nation, its relationship with India has been difficult, but then its neighbors aren't particularly easy to be around either, Afghanistan, Iran, and then where it fits in the world, so that's difficult. Then there are a number of underlying problems that are there no matter what. There are economic problems, there are problems with water, there are problems with electricity that can be fixed, but they still are difficult problems. They would be for any government in any country and similar. There are newer problems, an internal set of insurgencies, then there are more than one. There is the existence of Al-Qaeda there, which has brought all the attention, but there's the Baluch insurgency, there's the Pakistani Taliban, and then there's internal political challenges that Pakistan faces, sitting at this critical position with about 180 million people, the nexus between, obviously, India and then much of the rest of the region. And so I think that, and then of course you throw nuclear weapons on top of it. Even if you took nuclear weapons away, I think my answer would probably still be yes. But what we need to do is make sure we look at all the factors. Pakistan is like a complex system or a very complex equation that I could never solve at West Point. Too many variables. And so if you try to grab one and say the problem is the army, the problem is Al-Qaeda, you way oversimplify it. So I think that as we go forward as Americans, to David's point, what we need to do is deal with Pakistan in a very complex way. One of the things that used to disappoint me is we would go in 2004, 2005 to deal with President Musharraf or whatever, and we would go in with talking points that said, Al-Qaeda, 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 that's the big problem. And Pakistanis who I would deal with on the side, very close friends of mine, would say, we've got a bunch of problems. Al-Qaeda is about 10th. Help us with all of them so we can help you with that one.
On this, it's sometimes said that Pakistan's nuclear weapons are under much greater control, much better command and control than Americans realize, and that to that extent we should ratchet back our anxiety a little bit, that this is a better controlled system and structure than we think.
Well, my answer to your first question is that yes, I do believe that Pakistan is a dangerous place. But my second part of that answer is that not for the reasons the Americans think it is. The Americans don't get Pakistan. General McChrystal and many other generals, in fact, American diplomats going back to John Foster Dulles, go to Pakistan and hear one side, and they sometimes believe when Pakistani officials, especially generals, say, well, America must help us solve our problems. It's not America's problem to solve Pakistan's problem. It's Pakistan's problem to solve Pakistan's problems. And why is Pakistan a problem? Here's the reason. It was a country that was created with very little prior discussion and analysis. People forget. There's been an Egypt for 5,000 years. There's been an Iran for several centuries, for millennia. There's been an India for millennia. Pakistan is only 66 years old. So therefore, it has essentially a lot of psychoses more than it has actual threats and challenges. India, for example, I understand that Pakistanis are concerned about India, but as a Pakistani, I look at history, and of course I know that the American relationship to history is very unusual. It's the only country in the world where when somebody says that's history, he means that's irrelevant. But in case of India and Pakistan, it's important to understand, yes, India has never philosophically accepted the idea of Pakistan, but it has not been responsible for initiating any of the wars with Pakistan. Let's be real about that. Afghanistan is too weak and too poor to attack Pakistan. So most of the problems that Pakistan sees itself in are psychological rather than real. And the real problems are, we have not only 180 million people, we are 210 million according to this morning's estimates based on the population growth. Highest population growth rate in that region. Half the population is below the age of 21. 1/3 of them will never see the inside of any school. Forget about madrasas, religious schools, any school. They won't even go to a madrasa. 1/3 of that young population. 1/3 of the population lives below the poverty line. Another 1/3 lives just above it. And yet the country has nuclear weapons. And I'm the only Pakistani who has had the guts, in my opinion, to say that, look, the nuclear weapons should have finally made us secure about India. We have mutually assured destruction, so India will never invade us if we really believe India is going to invade us. Well, guess what? We are now like the guy who keeps buying guns to try and protect himself and then say, oh gosh, I can't sleep because I'm afraid somebody will steal my guns. And so now Pakistan has created this new psychosis that the Americans are going to come and take our nukes away. So the real threat to Pakistan essentially is from a failure to come to terms with its geography, with its history, and with having a direction for it as a nation. Benazir Bhutto, before she was assassinated, had a new vision for Pakistan. And her vision was, we will focus inwards, we will put the kids into schools, we will keep the nukes, but we will eventually sign up with some kind of international agreement that will make sure that we are not looked upon as a pariah. We will join globalization, and if American aid is available to us, we will use it like Korea did or Taiwan did. We are not going to live as an insecure nation, because that insecurity then makes people think, Al-Qaeda, well, how can we use them against our enemy, India, instead of considering them the enemy? And that is why we have these interrelated problems in Pakistan. So yes, dangerous place, but Americans sometimes don't.
General McChrystal, we do now have a moment where the page has been turned in Pakistan. We have a new government under Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, which has a whole new set of personnel, a new party, a new way of looking at the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, we think, some new ideas about India. And I'd be interested in your sense of Nawaz Sharif as a Pakistani leader. I'm going to ask Ambassador Haqqani the same thing. And then your thoughts about where the particular opportunities are in this next period with new leadership in terms of the U.S.
Sure. I do think we're at a pretty important inflection point, driven by a number of circumstances, to include the recent election, which was the first election in Pakistani history from a civilian government to a civilian government. They have never been able to complete a term before. And so being able to start a tradition of civilian leadership is critical. Pakistan, in my view, cannot continue with on-again, off-again military taking over leadership of the country. I think it's an important inflection point, and I think that if the role of the military can be shaped into something more appropriate. Pakistan's military became viewed by many Pakistanis with great respect, but within the military it became viewed as the essential organization. We think of George Washington as the essential man. The Pakistani military internally views themselves as the essential bulwark of Pakistani sovereignty, Pakistani pride, Pakistani freedom. And there's much less regard for the effectiveness of civilian Pakistani government than we would like in a good balance. Now, part of that's because Pakistani civilian government has not been impressive. But now I think Nawaz Sharif has the opportunity to potentially, like Erdogan has done in Turkey or other leaders have done, to reshape that balance a bit. Now, he's going to have to do it not just by controlling the military, he's also going to have, because I believe, and I may have a different view from the ambassador, when I deal with General Kiani or other military leaders in Pakistan, I don't see a bunch of duplicitous, dishonorable people. I see patriots who see the world through their lens and are trying to do what's right for their country. It might be different than what might be viewed by others, but I view it as pretty genuine. So he's going to have to shape that in a way that brings those two in better connection. Now, the question is, I don't know whether Nawaz Sharif can do it. I don't know him personally. I have read the histories of him, and when I was spending a lot of time in Pakistan, he was not in a position to be around. But we're asking an awful lot of a guy who's got a questionable background.
So I want to ask you, you know a lot about Nawaz Sharif. What thoughts would you offer about how he can develop a civilian government, make it work, and in particular, what advice would you have about how to deal with the problem General McChrystal said? How does he speak to the Chief of Army Staff, General Haqqani, or his successor, and make clear this Pakistani military isn't going to call the shots now? We have a civilian government. How does he do that?
Not with any ease. First of all, we must understand that American generals look at Pakistani generals and see fellow soldiers. Pakistanis, especially those who've been imprisoned by generals at one point or another, look at them as politicians in uniform. So it's a very different perspective. Nawaz Sharif has to move very carefully. Now, on the one hand, he wants to establish civilian supremacy. President Zardari was a lot sort of slower on that front. He used to move 2 steps forward, 2.5 steps backward sometimes, because he understood that the military does have far more influence. For example, the Pakistani military runs businesses, which the American military does not. Pakistan military runs media and has influence over media that the American military probably does not. And
wait for Snowden next week. And then
the Pakistani military tells Pakistan's parliament and parliamentarians and politicians what Pakistan's national interest is. The American military is part of the process of defining American national interest, but all of you are part of that process as well. Your politicians are, your media is. In Pakistan, the military wants to monopolize the definition of national interest, and that's my problem with them. That's all. Other than that, they're very decent people. My brother served in the military. My father served in the Pakistani military. So generals who think that they can actually determine national interest and they alone can determine it are going to be Nawaz Sharif's biggest problem. And that problem is going to start very soon. As he tries to put General Musharraf on trial, which personally I think is not necessarily a priority, it shouldn't have been a priority, but he wants to do it. When he does that, he will run into some problems with the Pakistani military. And so he has to move carefully on that front. I think he should focus on domestic.
I mean, that's a kind of classic revenge play. The man who kicked me out is, I'm going to go after him and put him on trial for treason. Why do you do that?
Because he's Nawaz Sharif. I mean, that's who Nawaz Sharif is. I worked with him, and when I did not agree with him and left his side, he had a little black mark against my name, and then when he got a chance, he tried to get even with me on that as well. Look, he's a provincial politician who became national just because there was no alternative to Benazir Bhutto on the Popular Front at that time. The Pakistani military and the ISI, there's a case pending in the Supreme Court still because the Supreme Court supports him. They don't let that case be decided. But the fact is that he ran for office in 1990 with ISI funding. I mean, that's like a presidential candidate in the United States running for office with CIA funding. You would never, let that happen easily, or at least
not easily.
And so this guy was the military. The military propped him up, and then he wanted to secure authority from the military, which made him and General Musharraf rivals. So I think he is doing that. I think it's a mistake. I think he should his priority should be solving Pakistan's internal problems, the economy, the educational system. scaling down the hatred that Pakistanis learn from their schools. Hatred against Jews, hatred against Hindus, India as an existential. There is no such thing as an existential threat. There are threats, there are lasting threats, there are longer threats. But you know what? Nations change their perception of threats. I mean, there might have been a time when the Mexicans and the Americans were fighting. Well, guess what? Now the Americans are figuring out how to have more Mexicans work in America. I mean, that's how the world moves. And so Pakistan's this view that somehow India will always be our enemy is a wrong view. We need to open up on that. And those are the things where Nawaz Sharif should focus rather than on settling scores with Musharraf or the army.